Let me begin by introducing myself. My name is Matt Friedman. I am the CEO of an organization called the Mekong Club, which I'll talk about a little bit later. I've been working on this issue of human trafficking for about 35 years. I began my career with USAID in Nepal, where I lived for 8 years. I spent another 5 years in Bangladesh, 10 years in Thailand, where I also joined up with the United Nations for 6 years, and now I'm living and working here in Hong Kong. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start off with just some basic information about human trafficking, but probably from the private sector perspective. You know, how does this relate to the private sector? Then I'm going to talk about ESG, I'm going to talk about my organization, and then at the end, we'll open it up for questions and answers. During this time, if you could keep your Zoom on mute, and if you have any questions along the way, put it in the chat, and then at the end, when we get to that point, I'll just offer whatever answers I have for whatever questions you may come up with. So to begin with, when most people talk about and think about human trafficking, obviously they think about forced prostitution. For good reason. There's 4.8 million women and girls in forced prostitution around the world. I don't have to get into the details of that. I think most of you have been exposed to this. Girl is tricked and deceived, taken away from her community, forced into a situation where she offers sexual services for people for a period of time, and we all know the devastating impact that that has. But what gets probably a lot less attention is the forced labor side of the equation. On the top right-hand corner, you have a Thai fishing boat. And once again, the kind of information related to how people get into the fishing industry is pretty widespread. A lot of people know about it. A young person is tricked into going onto the boat. He thinks it's only going to last a couple of months. It actually goes out for an extended period of time, maybe 3 or 4 years. During this time, he works excessive numbers of hours, sometimes 16, 17 hours a day. If he doesn't, he gets beaten and tortured. Many of them only have rice and fish to eat the entire time they're there, so that wreaks havoc on their body. Many times they are given drugs to stimulate them, and at the end of the 4 years, they don't get anything at all. Bottom left-hand example, in Thailand, we used to see a situation where, let's say a person from Laos sees a construction site, goes to the manager, says, I'd like to work there. They agree that he can have a job, but he's told that he can't have payment for 3 or 4 months. He works, he borrows money, and then after a couple of months, he goes and asks to get the payment. The foreman says, well, we need another 2 months, and then another 2 months, and another 2 months. And as a result of this process, after about 6 or 7 or 8 months, he's really getting to a point where he's desperate. He's borrowed a tremendous amount of money. He starts complaining. And then the next day when he arrives at the construction site, there are some remand center people. He's picked up, put into a remand center, and then eventually repatriated. He was never going to get paid. This is a kind of scam we see all across Asia, in the world, related to construction. And then the manufacturing side, where people are tricked and deceived and indebted and threatened. I'm going to go into a lot more detail, so I won't focus on this right now. But what I wanted to point out is that for the most part, we often hear about the fishing industry and the construction industry and the manufacturing industry. But within some of these categories, we're beginning to see subsets. For example, during the pandemic, we saw in Malaysia that rubber glove factories were being identified as having issues. And in the past, this was a company that would never be kind of profiled in addressing modern slavery. Once some of the articles and exposés came out about that, a few months later, we saw in Pakistan that surgical equipment was being made by children in forced labor type circumstances. And so what we're seeing is that different sectors that in the past we hadn't heard much about are beginning to make their way into the newspaper articles. And what we found is that if a particular industry has 3 or 4 major articles around the world, all of a sudden it becomes a phenomenon. And people are asking questions, and then more articles are being put in place. So the bright shining light that is focused on human trafficking seems to be going into other sectors. We see it, for example, in the tech sector. Facebook and Airbnb and other organizations are being put in the limelight. And another thing that we're seeing is even organizations that feel like they might be completely immune from anything related to modern slavery are also beginning to see that there is a potential tangential relationship between their business and something else. For example, I was in Singapore and I did a presentation to a pharmaceutical company. And this pharmaceutical company at the end of my presentation said, well, you know, thank you so much for all that information about human trafficking. But as an organization that has very high-tech employees that are paid very well, we don't really have to concern ourselves with this particular issue. So I looked at them and I said, well, who delivers your drugs from your warehouses to the stores? And they said, well, we have about a third of the trucks that belong to us. The rest are third-party contractors, people that are hired to do that. I asked them if they ever looked at the third-party contractors. They said no. When they finally did, a couple of months later, they came back and said, sorry, you know, we thought we were okay, but we found that some of those distributors were being significantly exploited. There was a trafficking type situation. Can you offer some help? I also did a presentation to a law firm, and the law firm said pretty much the same thing. We're a law firm. We don't have to be concerned about this. We don't have supply chains. But then what happened was I turned to them and I said, who cleans your building? They said, well, we don't know. So I said, look into it. A couple of weeks later, got a call from them and they said, wow, we found that the third-party cleaners that were in Singapore from a Bangladesh company were being exploited. Come and help us. The point I'm making is that we seem to think that we know the extent to which human trafficking and modern slavery is taking place. But as we continue to take that spotlight and look at other employment situations, we find that the risk is more acute and more potentially expansive than what we would have thought in the past. Now, when I talk to the private sector, and I work very closely with them, they're often asking me the question, well, we hear human trafficking and now people are using modern slavery as a terminology. Can you help us to understand kind of how these terms relate? And so the way I describe this goes as follows. You know, 35 years ago, human trafficking as a terminology didn't exist. You know, it's basically a new phraseology. But what happened back then is most of the cases that we were seeing were sex trafficking cases where a person went from one country to another. And so because that movement existed, they called it human trafficking because trafficking equates movement, like drug trafficking. You get the drugs, you move them someplace, you sell them. Or arms trafficking, you get the arms, you move them and you sell them. In this particular case, it was human beings. And so they felt like this movement was relevant to the process. But gradually over time, practitioners started to say, well, wait a minute. It really doesn't matter if a person goes from one country to another, or from one district within a country to another district, or from one side of the street to the other side of the street. Shouldn't we be focusing on the exploitation, not the movement? And so when they looked for a word in English that really encapsulated the situation of what we're talking about, where a person doesn't get paid and they can't leave and there's violence and threats against their family, documents are taken in debt bondage and so forth, the word slavery kept coming up. But because slavery is often associated with things that happened a long time ago, they put the word modern next to it. So modern slavery and human trafficking, they're very relevant. Human trafficking is almost the process by which a person enters into the endpoint, which is modern slavery, but you'll see them interchanged all the time. When it comes to kind of what are the indicators of modern slavery, for the private sector, there's only 11 that they really use. And these are the Ilo Indicators of forced labor. And you can see them listed here. And if you haven't seen the Ilo kind of forced labor indicator report, just Google it. It's an amazingly simple, informative document. It's worth putting down into your files because it really does encapsulate these various indicators. So up until recently, the number of people estimated to be in modern slavery, as we all know, is about 40 million people. In fact, according to the United Nations, there's more people in modern slavery or slavery in the world than any other time in history. I'll say that again, more slaves than any other time in history. When it comes to Asia, a disproportionate number of people who are modern slaves are in this part of the world, basically for two reasons. There are a lot of people in Asia, China, 1.4 billion people, India, 1.27 billion. And you have Pakistan and Bangladesh and Thailand and the Philippines and Japan. All of those countries have amazing population sizes. The second thing is that the feudal systems that have allowed for exploitation to take place in many of these countries have never been completely dismantled. So if you go to Thailand or to China and you go to Bangkok or to Beijing and you go 20 or 30 kilometers outside of these cities, you find a lot of exploitative systems that are very much still in place. When it comes to COVID and the impact that COVID is going to have on modern slavery, it's significant. In fact, it could go up, and I've heard these estimates from a number of different organizations, from 40 million to 60 million. And so the reason for this really comes down to just sheer desperation. You have a lot of people who, let's say a Bangladeshi woman was working at a factory, a garment factory. She's making pretty good money. She's happy. She's supporting 7 or 8 people at home. All of a sudden in China, you have this outbreak. A couple of months later, things begin to slow down. Things begin to stop. Contracts get terminated. They're not able to get their goods from one place to another. And this woman is told, well, there's no job for you. Come back next month, next month, next month. So here she is with no savings. The only way to survive is to borrow money. And if she borrows the money and has no way to pay it back, this is an opportunity for the people who lent her the money to basically come and say, well, if you can't pay this back, I need somebody to go off onto a fishing boat and all their money comes to me, or into one of these sweatshops or something else. And so the expectation is that we will see a significant increase in modern slavery. According to the World Bank, 500 million, let me say that again, billion people will fall back into poverty as a result of COVID. As a result of that, indebtedness, desperation, severe poverty, lack of opportunities makes it a very ripe situation for traffickers to fish in the pool of this disparity. When it comes to the rate of people, this is about a 20% turnover a year, people coming in and leaving. It's about 9.2 million people per year. In a day, 25,200 people. In the time it takes me to do this presentation, about 1,000 people or a new slave every 4 seconds. So if we count to 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, somewhere in the world, somebody's entering into a modern slavery situation. It could be in Thailand, it could be in China, the United States, the UK, Australia, we don't know, but this is the rate at which people kind of enter. When it comes to the percentage of children and adults, it's about a quarter of the cases would be children. The rest are adults. But most people think that human trafficking is predominantly forced prostitution. It only represents about a quarter of the cases. The rest of the cases, as I mentioned, are forced labor cases. And this is where it becomes relevant to the private sector. 60% of the forced labor cases have some relevance to the private sector, where we get our phones, our electronics, our clothes, our shoes, our food, our fish. And so the relevance of this to the world is very similar to what we saw with global warming, where when they were able to make the case that we as human beings use resources and electricity and energy, we are supporting global warming. This statistic demonstrates that as consumers, we buy things. A certain percentage of what we buy is tainted by modern slavery. So we have to be concerned about that. When it comes to who's supposed to be addressing this, well, it's supposed to be governments, but a lot of governments don't like this topic. It's embarrassing for the governments of Hong Kong and China and the UK and Australia and Cambodia and various other countries to have modern slaves. Activities are done, but usually not enough to make a significant difference. I worked for the United Nations for 6 years. I will put my hand on my heart and say that I believe in the United Nations system. But I spent a lot of time in 5-star hotels eating really good food, talking about this issue. There was a real disconnect and separation between what we were supposed to do and could have done and what we were actually doing it. So many of the organizations that are doing the lion's share of this are the non-government organizations, the people who are on this call. But if again, we come back to the statistics, out of the 40 million people, 75% in forced labor, 60% associated with supply chains, there's another group that needs to be involved in this, the private sector. But if you think governments don't like this topic, the private sector hates it because they're often on the receiving end of somebody wagging a finger and saying, you guys are so greedy that you would use slaves knowingly in order to get shareholder profits. Now, for big brands, for the brands that we often buy from, they would do anything and everything to avoid any association with exploitation, but that's not what consumers think. They really do feel that the private sector would get involved in this. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is show you the report card for the number of people who, were helped out of modern slavery last year. And then out of 500,000 criminals, I'll demonstrate how many of them went to jail. This statistic happens to be from 2021, and this is what the numbers were back then. 108,000 people helped out of modern slavery, which is 0.2%. When it comes to the 500,000 criminals, about 9,000 convictions. Now, what's interesting is that if you woke up this morning and you looked at the trafficking in persons report for 2022, you will see that these numbers are even lower. 90,000 people helped and the conviction rate of around 5,600. So if you look at this, some people ask, well, does the counter-trafficking world not care? Are we lazy? We're not doing our work? That's really not the issue. The issue is this, the profits generated from modern slavery, according to the United Nations, 150 billion US dollars a year. Globally, the amount of money that's used to address this issue is about 350 million or 0.23%. So you have a huge amount of profit with very little money available for the NGOs and the United Nations and the governments and the private sector to do this. To put this number into perspective, the United States eats a lot of potato chips, 6 billion US dollars worth. It takes 21 days of potato chip eating in terms of the amount of money that is generated from that to come up with the amount of money that's used globally to address modern slavery, which is 350 million. You can see kind of what it is that we're up against. Another thing is the scale. The number of people around the world that do this work full time like us is somewhere between around 20 and 30,000 against 500,000 greed incentivized criminals. We have to follow rules and regulations. They don't have to. They just make things up as they go along. And lastly, awareness of this issue among so many people is so low that if you don't know about an issue, you're not going to care. And if you don't care, you're not going to do anything. So what I'm going to do now is to switch over to the private sector and talk a little bit about kind of what the private sector is doing and why did they get involved. So for a long time, the private sector really didn't have much of a role in addressing this. But again, because of that 0.2 figure, what happened was people said, well, the private sector needs to get involved. Supply chains are associated with this. But in order to get the private sector involved, they felt like there needed to be some type of a business risk. So what you see are trends related to how the private sector has gotten involved in addressing modern slavery. The first kind of trend relates to legislation. Prior to 2012, you had kind of the United Nations and businesses and governments coming together to talk about human rights and human trafficking, and it resulted in the UN Principles for Business and Human Rights and some conventions that ILO had and so forth, and a lot of very good documents. But none of this was binding. So the first direct relationship with the brands, the big companies, was the supply chain legislation. And the first one came out in 2012. It was called the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act. This act basically says if you're a big company and you have profits of $100 million in retailer manufacturing, and you have a single product in California, you have to say on your website what you're doing to address modern slavery. If you're not doing anything at all and you say that, you're in compliance, but you have to say something. This allows for consumers to see what companies are doing or not doing. Then the UK Modern Slavery Act came, lowered it from $100 million to 36 million pounds, but they added a couple of additional things. Number one, you have an annual report that has certain prescribed things that the company has to put in there. And that has to be signed by the board of directors of that company, which means it raises it up to the highest level of the company. You have then the France Act, which duty of vigilance, the Australian Act. Most of these have a situation where they start off with the same components as the earlier acts, but they keep adding more bells and whistles. For example, the German act, which will come into play in 2023, will have fines and penalties against companies that are found to have forced labor. And the Canadian act has the same thing, but also a repository of all of the acts being in a single place. They'll be reviewed. And as a result of this, you will have much more emphasis on people knowing what's happening. We're seeing lawsuits against big companies. For example, some of the retailers are being sued for buying seafood from Thailand. And their justification for suing is that, well, because these big companies are buying large quantities of prawns, they are supporting modern slavery, because according to some of the statistics, about 18% of the sailors and the fishermen are exploited in kind of a forced labor, modern slavery type way. So in one case, what they actually wanted was for on the side of the tuna fish for there to be a statement that says this product could be tainted by modern slavery. Obviously, this is not good for a company. Now, while many of these lawsuits are not being won, they get their way into the newspapers and into TV program reports. And as a result of this, this creates a lot of reputational risk for big companies. As we've seen, the chocolate industry often finds its way into the news. And this is partly because there are a lot of children working in the cocoa industry. Now, about 12 years ago, this became a big phenomena. There was a lot of reporting. BBC was talking about it. And the chocolate industry got on airplanes, went down there, and for a period of time, it looks like they had fixed much of what the problem was. But then, because they didn't continue to kind of move forward with overseeing and monitoring the situation, it went back to what it was before. And so we see another round of kind of exposés related to the chocolate industry. As it relates to the hospitality industry, sex trafficking lawsuits against motels and hotels are taking place. And basically what happens is the motel is told, well, you had somebody who was a sex trafficking victim in your hotel for a period of time. You should have known that there was a problem. And as a result of that, there's negligence. These cases are being won. And the issue for the private sector is that the insurance companies don't now want to basically insure motels and hotels. And because they have to have insurance in order to run, this is a big problem for them. We're seeing a significant increase in media attention associated with human trafficking. Now, prior to, for example, in the 1990s, those of you who are a little bit older, like me, in the 1990s, we saw a lot of coverage related to kind of HIV/AIDS, and that lasted for about 10 years. When was the last time you saw an article or expose on HIV/AIDS? Probably not for a long time, because it was a phenomena that existed at that time. What replaced AIDS in the early 2000s for about 15 or 18 years was the climate change and global warming coverage. But now the new issue of our time seems to be modern slavery. We're seeing almost a doubling every year for the last 5-10 years of articles and exposés related to this. In fact, as I mentioned, you see a reduction in the environmental coverage relative to the fact that we're still seeing it, but slavery is kind of taking over. Another thing that we're seeing is that there are large organizations, NGOs, that use as their model going after private companies. I won't mention the name of this particular organization, but where the X's are would be the name of the company. And so this particular organization has a mailing list of about 8 million people. And so what they'll do is they'll mail to all the 8 million people, this particular company works with palm oil, they're doing bad things, there's exploitation, there's modern slavery. Send them an email or a letter basically saying that you're disappointed. So imagine if you worked for this company and you came in on a Monday morning and you had a nice weekend and you open up your inbox and there are 8 million very angry emails in there. The significance of this is that it creates reputational risk, it embarrasses the company, and it has an impact on sales. Another thing we're seeing is more stringent type of legislation related to goods that make their way into the United States. There's legislation that basically now says that if a product is, there's suspicion that it's made by forced labor, they could be stopped at the border, and then that company has to demonstrate that, in fact, forced labor wasn't involved. We saw it with rubber gloves. We're now seeing it with products that come from the Xinjiang region of China because of the internment situation where Uyghurs are being forced into factories and forced onto farms and so forth. And so any goods associated with that part of China, if they make their way in the United States, they are probably going to be stopped. And as a result of that, that has an impact on a lot of businesses. So what I'm going to do now is just talk a little bit about kind of the manufacturing sector and some of the issues that they face. And so let's say that we're talking about a running shoe. Okay, and maybe these running shoes are being made in this part of the world, here in Asia. The typical running shoe supply chain has 3 tiers. Tier 1 is where it's actually assembled, where, you know, the rivets and the shoelaces and the sewing and everything takes place. And many of these factories have been audited for many, many years, probably 30 years now. You usually don't find much of a problem at that level. But the lower tier, where you get the rivets and the shoelaces and the zippers and the textiles and various other things, nobody's been auditing that. Or in tier 3, where we're talking about the raw material, the metal, the rubber, the wool, the cotton. What the legislation basically says now is that you have to go all the way down to the lowest level of all of these in order to be able to address this. So let's say that you're a big company, you've been auditing factories for 30 years at tier 1, all of a sudden you have to do tier 2 and 3. That goes from 1,400 audits to maybe 5,000 audits. So you can see the conundrum that a lot of organizations are facing. Who's going to pay for that? Do we increase the price of the clothes and the apparel and the footwear as a result of this? And a lot of discussions related to that are taking place. Now, as I indicated before, these are the indicators that are often used in audits, the Ilo indicators, but I'm just going to go through a couple of them very quickly. So let's say that you're a Nepalese person and you're making $50 US a month in a village. A recruitment agent comes in and says, hey, brother, how would you like to make, $250 working in Malaysia? Sounds great. What do I have to do? Well, you have to go with me to Kathmandu. You have to sign a bunch of papers. You have to get some training. You got to give me $1,500 up front, and then we'll send you to Malaysia. I says, I don't have $1,500. They say, don't worry about it. You can just borrow. We have systems. We'll get it all sorted out. You can pay it back very quickly. So he goes to Kathmandu, gets all the training, ends up going to Malaysia. But by that time, $1,500 is about $2,500 with interest and fees and other things that he didn't understand in the contract. So he ends up having to work for sometimes years to pay back the initial loan as well as the interest and so forth. That's debt bondage. It allows for the factory to hold them in place. It's part of the problem that we consider to be modern slavery. So this is one of the indicators, kind of recruitment fees that basically hold people in place. Let's say that same Nepalese person reads the contract in Nepalese or has somebody read it to him. And then when he gets to Malaysia and he gets off the plane, they say, you have to sign this contract. He looks at it and says, well, it's not in a language I know. You have to sign it anyways. Sorry, I can't. If you don't sign it, you're going to be sent back and you're going to lose everything. So he signs this second contract, not realizing that there are additional fees and things in there that cheat him. So instead of getting $250, maybe it's down to $130 a month. Plus he's paying for the recruitment fees. The other thing that happens when he gets off is they take his documents and they basically say, well, you have to stay here and we're not going to give this back to you until you finish your term. So let's say he wants to leave. He can't because he doesn't have the documentation. So the documentation becomes the leverage. So as a result of this, what we're seeing is that a lot of companies that we work with are offering training to the entire brand, to the entire company, but also to the factories and the sub-factories. And they're all going down to the lower levels in the language that the factories need to hear this in. Because as we know, most of what's out there is in English. You got to make sure that if you're in Myanmar, that you're training people in that particular language, Burmese. Recruitment and labor standards. What the brands are saying is that we will not work with factories that have any indebted employees. And if anyone's indebted, that factory has to pay it back. Sometimes the brand pays it, but that indebtedness becomes a major vulnerability or indicator, and so they ensure that that isn't in place. We're seeing that there are more grievance mechanisms, tools, apps, and so forth to allow workers to report what's happening. And lastly, there's a lot more emphasis on going deeper into the audits to ensure that there's nothing going on that could potentially indicate that there's a problem associated with a particular organization. So what I'm basically saying is that because of this legislation, because of the interest that people have in the particular topic, because people want to know that the clothes and the items that they buy are not tainted by modern slavery, many of the major corporations around the world are spending more and more time ensuring that, in fact, there is no issue associated with them. So I want to talk a little bit about the banks. Now, you can understand why the manufacturers or the retailers might be concerned about this because they have supply chains, but why would banks be concerned about this? Why would they want to address this particular issue? And this is the reason why. The profits generated from modern slavery, as I mentioned, 150 billion US dollars a year. That translates to every second you basically have. Please go away. Sorry, somebody's knocking at my door. That's about $4,000 per second that we're dealing with here. And as a result of that, we have a situation where tremendous amounts of profits are being generated as a result of this. So what we have then here is money laundering. If any of that illegitimate money gets into a legitimate bank, it's money laundering. The bank itself gets fines and penalized. And so what you have to do as a bank is to ensure that that's not happening. And so what we have, for example, in Australia is a bank that was fined 1.3 billion Australian dollars because they allowed online sexual exploitation of children to take place, and they didn't do anything about it. Other banks are fined 60, 70, 80 million dollars. These are huge fees. So the banks have to be concerned about this because these fines and penalties also have an impact on the reputation of the bank, whether or not people want to use the bank. This results in naming and shaming. This results in loss in investment. So as a result of this, organizations have to be concerned about this. So what are the banks doing? Well, they're developing what are called typologies, which basically looks at the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim and the various steps that a person goes through and their transactions along the way. They're then using that information to identify through accounting mechanisms whether or not there may be a problem with a client or a company that they work with. They then take that information and they look at big data to determine whether or not there's patterns, and we're seeing more of an emphasis on the NGOs working with law enforcement. Okay, so when it comes to typologies, this is just an example so you can see what it looks like. The typology has various steps, and you can see the perpetrator and the victim together, and then on the bottom you see certain transactions that take place. So the banks study these transactions and identify which of them are red flags, which of them would be considered to be problematic. Once they have that list, then they do forensic accounting. So what they'll do is they'll take these indicators and apply it to a particular business. So let me give you an example. In the United States, there was a nail salon chain. It had hours from 9 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock at night. What they were finding basically were that there were transactions in the same business at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, all around $200 US. When they looked into it, they came to realize there was a sex trafficking ring being kind of run in this same business. So the red flag indicators in this particular case would be transactions after hours around $200 in a particular type of business. If you take those transactions and apply it to big business, what you find are other patterns in other locations. And so what the banks will do is when they find this suspicious activity, by law, they are mandated to fill out what's called a suspicious transaction report, which goes to the government authorities. And the government authorities look at this. Another thing that we're seeing is the change that the NGOs and the law enforcement are getting much closer to basically understanding what's happening in human trafficking by talking to the NGOs, by talking to law enforcement, by taking their data, listening to how these patterns work. And by doing this, the banks can then identify how to protect themselves. Lastly, as I mentioned, the hospitality sector has to be concerned about this because they have construction that could be fraught with modern slavery. They have supply chains where they get seafood, so they could be called out for buying that if it's perceived to be tainted by modern slavery. They have contract workers that are brought in to do dishwashing, to clean the rooms, to do security. Some of them could be cheated because of the recruitment fees, and then forced prostitution, as I mentioned. So what I'm going to do now is to switch over to ESG. Now, ESG is a concept that's been around since around 2007. And what it basically means, it's an acronym for environmental, social, and governance. And it's kind of like the private sector version of the SDGs, the Sustainability Development Goals that we all know, the 17 of them. And, you know, if you're working in modern slavery, you know that SDG 8 and 10 and 17 have direct relevance to kind of what it is that we're doing. And in the case of the governments, what they're trying to do is within a 15-year period, address all of these poverty-related issues and problems around the world to make the world a better place. Now, as it relates to modern slavery, I've heard people say that by 2030, they're going to try to eradicate modern slavery. That's in about 12 years. 8 years, it would basically take 12,000 cases being addressed a day in that period of time in order for that to go away. You can see the challenge that we're up against. And as I mentioned, very few cases are actually being run. So when it comes to ESG, what happens is a major company will have a set of indicators related to the environment or related to the social side, which includes human trafficking, modern slavery, human rights, and governance, how they basically, work with the people within the company. And those indicators come together and they get a coefficient score. And then investment companies take that score and use it to determine whether the company is viable, whether the company is working in a direction of purpose. And as a result of that, they are investing more money in companies that use this indice and this indicator. And so if you look at ESG and the SDGs, you can see that there's a relationship. Now, at present, the ESG scores don't go into the SDG scores, but I think in the future, you're going to see that that's a transition, and that's the direction that we're going in. Why is this important? Because millennials care about this. There was a report done among millennials that identified that 84% of the millennial investors cared about ESG and cared that companies were doing this, and that these same millennials will be asset managers for the major investment funds in the next 10 years, over $30 trillion. And as I mentioned, the portfolios, the investment portfolios that include ESG as companies that for the most part are basically filling out these indicators are doing much better investment-wise than the companies that are not, which means that more and more companies are switching over to an ESG format. For those of you who want to better understand the S in ESG, and the relevance of this is that most of ESG, kind of up until now, has focused on the E, the environmental side, or the G side. So a company like Tesla would emphasize the E and the G indicators, not putting much emphasis on the S ones, and then they'd get a really good score. But when you start looking at the S and you start adding that in there, the human rights side, a company like Tesla is going to run into a problem because they get their cobalt and their lithium from the Congo, where we know there's forced labor associated with it. So there's a particular report, if you're interested, it's called Amplifying the S in ESG, Investor Mythbusters, that identifies the various myths associated with the S, and it talks about the future direction that ESG will go in. So when it comes to the steps that a company goes then, in order to develop the ESG template, they identify what their issues are, and then they build a strategy to address those issues, and then they start to track those indicators, and they start putting that information out in a public way. And then this disclosure allows for consumers and investors to see what companies are doing or not doing. So what is the future of ESG? I think eventually 3 years from now, what you will have is a system whereby every major company will be required to have a standardized set of ESG indicators. And those indicators will be, for the first time, the naughty and the nice list. Those companies that are filling it out, those companies that are doing the right things, those companies that are able to validate that what they're doing is in fact helping the world to be a better place, will get higher scores. Those that are not doing ESG or have low scores in certain areas will be dinged. And then for the first time, consumers and investors will be able to say, we're going to invest and work with this company because they're better than other companies. Up until now, we haven't had that. So it's difficult to know which companies are doing the right thing, which companies are not, which is why ESG is so relevant and important. So what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about the organization that I run. It's called the Mekong Club. We work with the private sector in a positive, supportive, non-naming and shaming way. And we do this in order to help them to understand the issue of modern slavery, what they need to do in order to address it and how they address it. And so basically the Mekong Club has an association model where we have major companies that come together on a quarterly basis to talk about, to debate, to discuss, and identify what needs to be done to address modern slavery. I mentioned all of the various sectors. We have the banking and the finance world. We have the manufacturing world, the retailers, the hospitality. We work with the tech sector. We work with construction. We work with these companies, but we work with them in a very positive way. We do nothing to basically embarrass them or shame them. The first thing we do is we basically have an assessment. And what we do is we have these companies identify through this self-assessment where they are in their journey. You know, do they sensitize C-suite? Does the board understand this? Do they have codes of conduct and policies? Do they have governance mechanisms? Do they train, et cetera, et cetera? And then based on this, we work with them to put a strategy in place to be able to address this. We have worked with other kind of tools, just to give you a sample of some of the 30 tools that we have available. One tool takes anonymized audit data and then basically analyzes it to see in a particular geographical location, a province within a country, for example, what are the Ilo indicators that they're finding in these audits. This type of mechanism allows for corporations to understand the vulnerability that exists within a particular location based on these patterns. We developed an app called Apprise. This app allows for auditors to go into factories. And then let's say that there are people from other countries. They don't know where those people come from. They get the person to press the flag from where they come from. And then with headphones on in that person's language, it says, we're going to ask you some questions. If the answer to the question is yes, press green, no, press red. And then you give about 30 questions. Are you being exploited? Do you have indebtedness? Do you have any problems? Do you need any help? By using this tool, there's a significant increase in the number of people that have been identified to address this. There's also an NGO version of this that looks at sex trafficking and other agriculture and fishing and various other things that's available. We do all kinds of comparisons of legislation, deep dive analysis, the implications, operational plans, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of e-learning. We've developed e-learning toolkit, which includes 15 3.5-minute films in multiple languages: English, Cantonese, Thai, Burmese, Vietnamese, et cetera, et cetera. Once again, because for people to understand this, you need it to be presented in a particular language. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of give a couple of stories about the private sector's involvement. And I'll say this from the perspective that a lot of people think that the private sector is inherently evil. And a certain percentage of the private sector may fall into that category. But there are also a lot of organizations that do great work. And in fact, some of the organizations, the private sector companies that I work in, do as much, if not more, than a lot of the NGOs do, because they have to protect their business. So a couple of years ago, I was in Washington, D.C. I was at a conference, a banking conference, the American Banking Association conference. I finished a panel, and this guy comes up and says, "I'd like to tell you a story." I said, "Great, what's your story?" He said, basically, you know, I was taking my wife from one part of the United States to another. My teenage daughter was with us. We drove, got to the halfway point, pulled into a motel. I got my wife and daughter settled, and as I was leaving to get food, I saw this girl being pulled into a hotel room. It looked like forced prostitution. I have a teenage daughter. I was really concerned about this. So after the door was closed, I went and I told the manager, not knowing if anything would happen. Sure enough, about 15 minutes later, the police came. 15 minutes later, that guy was being taken out in handcuffs. A couple of women were taking the girl away, presumably to a shelter. And he said, I just wanted to tell you this because I was so proud of myself. It was a milestone, in my life. I'm so, so happy. It's one of those things I'll remember forever. So I looked at this guy and he said, well, what do you do? He says, well, I'm a banker. I said, yeah, I get that. You're at a banking conference, so I get that. What do you do within banking? He says, well, I do compliance work and I do risk work. And I asked him if he worked on human trafficking cases. He said, yeah, we do. We run those cases to see whether or not there's potential for human trafficking. And I said, what do you do with the information? He says, well, we fill it out and we send it off to the regulators. So I looked at this guy and I said, dude, do you not realize that you have been doing this work for a long time? Maybe not as directly as this particular case, but by you filling out those suspicious transaction reports and sending them off to somebody else, those cases get run. Some of those people may have been arrested as a part of this. You are a hero. Did you not realize that? So he looked at me and he kind of had an epiphany, like, oh my gosh, yeah, you're right. What we do does make a difference. It is important. So a couple of months later, I was in Singapore. I presented at the Singapore Banking Association meeting. There were about 600 bankers in the room, and I told them that story. And I talked about how their work by the banks basically looking at this and addressing this really does help to ensure that law enforcement know what's happening. And after I did the presentation, I must have had about 10 or 12 or 15 people come up to me and say, oh my gosh, you're right. We do this work and nobody ever gives us a pat on the back. Nobody ever says anything really positive, supportive. Thank you very much for that. Now I say this because it's not just the banks, the auditors. I went to Chinese factories in the early 1990s. They were pretty exploitative back then, but years later, they're a lot better because the audits have been taking place. The companies have gone in there every year, identified things, fixed things, made things better. The point I'm making is that the private sector has a role to play. The private sector is able to contribute to helping to address the issue of modern slavery, and so we should consider them to be partners as part of this process. So with that, I'm done. Thank you very much. I'll stop the share, and if you have any questions, by all means, let me know, and I'm happy to answer them. You can either put them into the chat, or what I prefer to have happen is for you to just unmute yourself and then just ask your question directly. So with that, let's jump into it. Okay. Morgan, do you want to just kind of say your comment? It just makes it a little bit interactive. You could just unmute yourself.
Yeah, I can do that. So I was just wondering, we obviously know that social auditing often does fail workers. Workers are often trained how to answer audits, and they have consequences if they're too honest, even sometimes with anonymous worker surveys. So I guess my first question is just, what are your thoughts on the best way forward for businesses wanting to meaningfully address modern slavery in their supply chains? And then if there's time, and I wrote this as the second question, do you think a business can meaningfully address the root causes of slavery in their supply chain without paying living wages?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. We all know that social audits have a lot of limitations associated with them, especially if, for example, the factory knows that the auditors are coming. There could be coaching that takes place. In some cases, you would have the manager following the auditor when they're doing their worker interviews. And that's part of the reason why you use apps like the one that I mentioned, the Apprise app, because the headphones are on and the person is answering questions, but the management has no idea what's being said. And the other thing is that no individual score goes to an individual person, so nobody knows who basically had that. Coming up with creative ways to be able to expand that, to have other grievance mechanism tools to allow workers to be able to talk about their feedback is really relevant and important. The living wage question is another really important one. We all know that in a lot of countries, the wage that's offered, in fact, even the minimum wage, is insufficient to really support a standard of living that is considered to be a viable standard of living. Having worked in 40 countries around the world with a lot of governments, I think that the living wage question is going to be a gradual process that will take place. There was some momentum leading up to COVID. I think that a certain amount of that momentum in the country that I've been working in has slowed down because of the situation with factories bleeding out resources and so forth, and a lot of distractions that are taking place. So can we fully get to a point where that's addressed and be able to ensure that exploitation is not taking place? I think there's always going to be a degree of exploitation that's just always going to be there until that happens, but I don't see this as being something that's going to change significantly quickly in the next couple of years. In fact, I had a factory owner say to me, you know, I'm going to exploit my workers. I lost so much money during the pandemic that I am hardly surviving. If they want a factory in their community to work in, then, you know, they better allow for me to exploit them. So we have a certain amount of catching up that has to take place. I hope that answered your questions.
Yeah, thank you.
Can somebody else just unmute yourself and then just ask your question? Okay, so I see another one. While it may be easier to work with banking institutions, what about money transfer agencies that earn profits off of people that would prefer secondary channels of monetary transfers? How to align their interest in auditing? Very good question. You know, there almost seems to be a disconnect between a lot of the kind of social auditing that's taking place and anything related to the financial side of things. So the banks are on one track, and the financial transaction companies are on another track, and then the auditors are on another track. And as a result of that, there isn't a lot of what I would describe as cohesiveness associated with kind of those various components. There should be. Now, what we recently did, and I think it's on our website, is we came up with a list of financial questions that should be included in victim identification intake forms. And it looks at, did you see the perpetrator using ATMs? Do they have credit cards? What type of transactions do they have, or whatever? Because part of what can be done is that if we get that financial transaction information, we can go after criminals' money, you know. And so, as we all know, many of the kind of criminal cases against traffickers can take a long time, and a lot of those cases don't end up in a conviction, partly because somewhere along the line a bribe takes place or a threat takes place, and so it's very time consuming and very problematic. Another way of addressing that is with anti-money laundering. So if there's a criminal that, let's say he's an Australian who has bars in a red light district area that have been known to have modern slavery associated with it, but in Thailand, he's protected because of his network and corruption and various other things. If you can figure out where his bank accounts are outside of Thailand, all you have to do is to go to the local regulators with a 2-page statement that says, we think this person is doing criminal activities, and that person's bank accounts will be frozen. And then in order to unfreeze them, he has to, or she has to, go back to that location to make a case that he's not or she's not doing criminal activity. That's an effective way of really harassing criminals in a very easy way, because you don't need all kinds of criminal documents or anything. You just need to be able to say there's sufficient concern here that we think something needs to be done. So working with the financial side of the equation has the potential to have impacts that are going to really make a difference. I hope that answers your question. Okay, other questions? We have about 4 more minutes left. Who's going to jump in? Do you have anybody else? Okay, go ahead, Kassel. Am I saying it right? Please ask your question.
Thanks, Matt. I'm Kosa from Cambodia. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very nice and very helpful for us, as we are the implementer related to the survivor from the modern slaveries. Sometimes identification is not easy, the process is not easy for the implementer and also local authorities. So sometimes the perpetrator or another suspect criminal person always be away from the law. So my question, I would like to know from you, based on your experience and based on your survey, may you share us that how can we collaborate between private sector and also local authorities and developing partner like CSO, something like that, together to make sure that those suspected criminal person or those people who have commit crime for modern slavery to be in line together, like that. You know what I mean? I'm sorry, Matt.
Yes. Yeah, I do. Actually, that's an amazingly good question, but it requires a tremendous amount of content. I will be in Cambodia in the third week in November, and I will be there doing a series of presentations. And one of the presentations will be helping NGOs to understand how to relate to the private sector. And so go on my website. You can send me an email. If you're in Cambodia at the time, come and attend that particular event, and we'll go into that in great detail. Because I just have to say a few things about this. The private sector does not trust the NGO world, and to a certain extent, the NGO world doesn't trust the private sector. Now, there are good and bad actors within the private sector. Most of the organizations that I work with, I would describe as good actors. They care about the world, they're doing things, they're trying to make the world a better place by doing what they do to look for modern slavery in their supply chains. They do it to prevent their company from getting into trouble. But at the same time, by doing that, they are also protecting the world and making the world a better place. They don't talk about this, and they don't talk about how they address modern slavery or forced labor because they can't. It would affect their business and hurt their reputation. So I know it's happening. And I can say with a certain amount of kind of support that, you know, a lot of these companies do make a difference. A lot more need to get involved. But this question of how do the NGOs relate to the private sector is a really good one. And I think what sometimes happened when I was with the United Nations, we had a situation where once a year we would bring the private sector in the UN together. We would have a lunch, we'd have a couple of flowery speeches, and then we'd say we want to collaborate. But that was the only time you're going to get those people in a room. They don't do more than one event. And when you have them in a room, you have to have a call to action. You have to say what you want from them. And if it's reasonable, they'll work with you. If not, they'll tell you that as well. But there are certain ways of working with the private sector that require a training, if you will. It took me 10 years to get to a point where I was no longer an NGO person. I was able to integrate myself into the private sector because my mentality and my approach is much different. And I'm going to say one more thing, and then I'm going to have to end. And that is one of my early presentations to some private sector people 10 years ago. I had my deck of 160 slides, and I started presenting. And after my fourth slide, they asked me if I was almost done. They want you to tell them in a very short way, what do you want us to do? How do you want us to do it? You're the expert. You don't need to tell us that you're an expert. Just tell us what we need to do. So the point I'm making is there is a way of training for this. So I see I'm 1 minute over. I'm going to have to stop now. You can reach me at my the MekongClub.org. If you have any questions, as I said, I'll be in Cambodia. I'll be in Thailand in December. I'll be in various other locations. Yeah, I've listened to a number of you speak. Amazing job. Keep doing what you're doing. It's super effective, and thank you very much. I really appreciate it. With that, I'll just end now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. God bless everyone.
Thank you all very much. Yes.